So just explain about that $8.1 million. How is it calculated? Is that all, I mean, do we already expect that's what we will be receiving? And what number of students is that based on?
I don't know if we have the backup. I don't have the backup handy for the actual number of students, but we have 45% of our students are free and reduced now. So we do, so a number of those, I mean, I would guess that same percentage of our K through third grade kiddos are free and reduced as well. Maybe a little bit higher usually on the elementary side versus the high school side, but approximately. So we do have that data. So what we're doing is each one of those students, we're taking 1/10 of the basic allotment, okay, to calculate what that additional allotment would be.
Okay, so
Okay.
that's so that's money that we estimate is going to come to Fort Bend ISD if these bills passed, whether or not full day pre-K has to be implemented next year, or is it all tied together?
I think it's tied together. I don't think that they would do the early reading allotment without full day pre-K
Without
being part of the
mandating.
bill.
Okay. So, all right, thank you. So one of the things you spoke about a couple of, or last month over at the chamber, when you were talking about charters, was marketing. And I think that's key because you brought up a really good example of how some of these charter high schools get away with saying 100% of their kids get, college admission, and that's because if they don't, they're out of the charter.
Right.
Okay. So a lot of it is marketing. So part of the question is have we thought about how we would market pre-K to compete against those charters, especially over there on the west side? And then the other thing is, do we think, or have we thought, or will we think, that when or if we get some of these kids in the door away from the charters, that they will continue with in Fort Bend ISD? So I think that's something also to really consider. Because we've talked about this a lot. We talked about it last year about how, we're losing 8,000 kids, district-wide, and to private, and that's $40 million. You were just talking about the $20 million in this case. So that's a lot of money, and so I think that becomes really key. So we need to make sure if we're going to commit to this, or if we're mandated to commit to this, then it has to be done right, and we really have to market it. So
No,
thank
definitely. I mean, I'll let Veronica chime in if she wants to after I make this comment. I mean, we've been talking to a marketing firm that just specializes in retaining or recruiting back your students, and we've issued an RFP for services, but we won't expect to have something for the board to approve until July, August. But in the meantime, what can be done? We are working to engage with that group to find out what ideas we could do in the short term to help us on the marketing efforts. I don't think we talked to them specifically about pre-K yet, though.
Not specifically about pre-K, but that is included. And I will say that we've also been working with some of our districts in the other part of the state who do have full-day pre-K, and especially at the TSPA conference, gathered information and best practices that they have been using successfully. And so we brought those materials back and plan to use those as well as the marketing team that we put together.
Okay, and this is one of the things that I brought up a year or two ago, whenever it was, when I brought up the micro-society stuff. And one of the things that was really successful in doing was bringing all these kids back to Kingsville. I mean, they lost so many kids to neighboring districts that were really far away, and that brought them back. So just, again, something to consider. Something if it's that program or something similar, then something to make our school special. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the presentation. I wanted to echo a few things that were said, some of the comments and questions that were made, but some of my own neighbors that have young children that are going to be going to our school system have recently, because I live on the west side and there's a lot of competition with charters and what have you, they're just signing up because they feel as if there's value to be accepted to something. And I think marketing is key to that, because there's just a lot of misconceptions about what public school and private school charter schools both offer. So I once again will echo that I think that's crucial. Thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. Next, we are going to have our 1920 budget update.
Yes, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Bassett again for a brief budget development update.
Okay, so while Brian's stepping up, I'll get started. So what we have to do is, regardless of what goes on in Austin right now, we still have to adopt a budget. Okay, and we need to adopt it in June. We have to post for that budget with what we think the numbers will be, and have to put that in the newspaper. So we have to pretty much decide by mid-May what we think those numbers are going to look like. So the clock's ticking, and we do need to come up with something. Now we need to understand that it could probably be amended. So that's what we're getting at here. We're going to put together a budget plan that is going to be based on current law. While we think that there's something that could be adopted, the possibility does remain that it could that they may not have a meeting of the minds on these bills until they get to the special session. And so that is if they have a special session. So we have to move forward with what we know. So we're going to work to create a budget that does focus on the board priorities and to be within our 90 days requirement. Now, if we adopt a budget like that, we need to understand that it's likely to be amended, based on what happens in Austin and then what we learn. And then we're going to show you some numbers here. And so a tax ratification election, as we've spoken, may be needed to fund the priority. So I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening, Dr. Dupree, members of the board, Mr. President. I want to start out with the assumptions that we're using in the 1920 budget. As Steve mentioned, we are using the current law as the basis of our assumptions as we move forward. And as you look through this list, this is a format that we've used in the past. The items that are highlighted in gold are going to be items where there are still decisions to be made or information will be forthcoming. Those items that are in green are going to be the items where we have concrete information on that. So as we look at this, the first item that you'll notice on the list is going to be the property value growth. Currently, we are using 5%. We met with the chief appraiser back in February to triangulate the estimates that we had with what they had. And essentially, what we were trying to avoid, as you may recall, 2 years ago, we had a situation where there was a divergence between the numbers that they produced for us or provided to us and what we had calculated, and we're trying to avoid that revenue uncertainty. So we feel like the 5% number is a conservative number, and it will not result in us having to change our revenues as we go through the budget process. The other item that we have on here is going to be associated with the Austin yield. Right now, we have used $126, and that's based on legislative budget board calculations. That's an increase from 106 to 126. And then the final two items that are on there that we still have some uncertainty around are going to be our water growth and our free and reduced counts. And I say uncertainty, we update those numbers based on 6 weeks report. This is based on the most recent 6-week report. When we get the final 6-week report, we expect that will be there will be some changes there, but typically those are to our benefit. The two final points that I want to make are that the assumptions that we're using include the 226 positions that the board approved in February and March. So those are baked into the numbers that we'll share with you in just a moment. That's just over $15.5 million. And then it's really important to understand that at this point, we are not accounting for any compensation adjustments at all. And I'll provide some more detail on that in just a moment. So I want to briefly touch on this. This isn't so much for board consideration, but it's to give you an idea of the magnitude of priorities that staff is currently in the process of reviewing for inclusion in the final budget. That number is just under $30 million. So as I walk through the budget items in just a moment, this is just more so you can reflect back on items that we're working through as we build the budget. We do expect to end this year better than we're currently showing in the budget. At this point, we're forecasting an increase to fund balance of about $3.7 million. That's in contrast to what the current budget shows of a deficit of about $10.5 million. Part of the reason for the change between the current budget or the budget and our year-end estimate is that we have revenues of about $11 million. $4 million of that, you may recall, we had a discussion with you earlier in the year on the frozen value, and that is the value that the seniors have on, they have a cap on the taxes that they pay. And we expected, there was a discrepancy between what we received initially from the chief appraiser and the final roll. And I say a discrepancy, it was the change between the preliminary roll and the certified roll. So that's accounting for $4 million of that. In addition to that, the way that the SHARS revenue we receive, that's the school health and related services revenue we receive from the federal government, they changed the timing of when they make the payments to us. So we received 2 payments this fiscal year as opposed to the typical 1. However, that's a one-time occurrence that won't occur next year. So we received an additional $7 million that wasn't included in our original forecast that was unexpected for this fiscal year. So that's the reason for the discrepancy between our current budget and our year-end estimate. The next thing I'll say that as we move into the next, or as we end the year, we do expect to end the year with an operating reserve that's equal to 100 days of our expenditures. You're aware that that needs to be 90 days. So at this point, we are above our policy requirement, or expect to be above our policy requirement. As we move into the next year, based on current law, the numbers that you see in front of you, the $683 million for revenues is based on the projections that I showed you, or I just completely lost train of thought there, but the assumptions that were on the prior slide, the $683 million is the revenues that the 5% would generate, and those prior numbers that I mentioned. On the expenditure side, the $674 million represents the total expenditures, including those positions that I previously mentioned. So at the end of the day, we would be left with a surplus of about $9 million. And as again, I wanted to frame that on the previous slide to show you that we have about $30 million in priorities that we would be looking to fund. So that $9 million that's available would be prioritized based on what we expect the needs that the board, the expectations of the board and the priorities that they have. If we were to go forward with that, again, there is nothing for compensation, and none of those priorities are built into this number. It's just showing the capacity that is available. The next column over is if we were to move forward with a TRE, as Steve mentioned, based on current law, that would generate about $35 million in additional revenue. That is net of recapture. So recapture is about $9 million of that. So the actual numbers is closer to $44 million. But this is a net number that we would receive that would be available for expenditures. That would leave us with additional capacity of about $44 million. So again, you can juxtapose that with the number that I mentioned earlier on some of the needs that we have available. And I did mention, as I said, at this point, we don't have anything related to compensation included in the budget. Part of the reason for that is there is a divergence between the dollar amount that's currently included in the Senate bill versus the House bill. The Senate bill has a mandatory $5,000 raise, whereas the House bill has a floor of at least roughly $1,800 that would be expected. So essentially what they're saying is a portion of the basic allotment increase that we're being given would have to be allocated to some sort of mandatory teacher raise, but we don't know what that looks like. What we're attempting to avoid, though, is that in the past there have been cases where at the local level raises have been given by the district or a district, and then the state follows up with a mandatory requirement, and those raises are considered in addition to and not part of the raises that the state are giving. So we want to avoid that situation. So at this point, we're being very cautious with how we anticipate handling employee compensation. So again, as you look at the numbers, that isn't built in. But again, to provide you with a scale, a 2% increase is equated to about $10 million. So each 1% is roughly $5 million. So if we were to look at something beyond 2%, you can add $5 million for each 1% above that. As we move forward, what we're looking at on this particular situation is if House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 4 were enacted as currently written. So what we did is took the information previously presented to you and moved that forward. So the 1920 based on current law, and what would happen if House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 4 were enacted. So again, these expenditures don't include anything beyond what the board has previously approved, with one exception that I'll note in just a moment. So as we look at House Bill 3 with no tax ratification election, we would recognize about $18.8 million in additional revenue. This is based on that 3% that is currently included in the law that says we would be held harmless for 5 years. That's what is represented in that roughly $19 million. On the expenditure side, the change that we would see is that, again, House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 4 mandate full-day pre-K, so the $8.4 million you're seeing is from the earlier presentation that Deanna and Steve showed you, and that is building in those assumptions. On the revenue side, I didn't point out, but there is a slight increase from the current law to House Bill 3, Senate Bill 4. That's including the additional ADA from going from roughly 40% participation in the pre-K program to that 75% number. So that's the divergence of the revenue number there. So at the end of the day, if we had the House Bill 3 enacted as currently written, we're expecting about a $22 million surplus. But again, that does not include any of the priorities that we're currently in the process of going through, or compensation. And then the next step that would be on there is if we were to do a tax ratification election based on House Bill 3, that generates an additional $76.2 million in revenue. So that's 2 additional golden pennies and 13 copper pennies. So that's quite a bit of revenue obviously coming in. The change there, if you look on the expenditure side, is going to be associated with the full-day pre-K program again. So the $8.4 million to $10.23 million is adding the 1-to-1 ratio on teachers to aides. So that's the change in expenditures there. But that does result in about $97 million in capacity that could fund employee compensation and other board priorities that may exist. And the thing that I'll point out, at least at this point, all of these scenarios are showing that we are above the 90-day policy. We particularly wanted to show that on the budget with no tax ratification election, because we recognize that that's one of the most important things that we have, is that we want to keep within 90 days. So going back to those decisions that the board has made related to employees previously with the opening of the CTE Center, Malala Elementary, we do have capacity for those positions as well as the SPED positions that were added in the prior meetings. So that's part of the reason we wanted to show you that. Before I wrap up, I do want to show how the tax ratification election works in terms of revenues on if House Bill 3 were to go forward. We showed you a moment ago the $683 million in revenue that we generate under current law. And then again, that hold harmless component that is built into House Bill 3 at this point generates about $18.8 million in revenue. And it's important to state in this revenue is only good for 5 years. So that provision doesn't go on beyond 2024. So this is really revenue that's more of a one-time nature, but it is important to show what it looks like in our overall forecast. The next component of that, as you may recall, the current law does compress the existing tax rate and adds to it, or results in 2 additional golden pennies. Those golden pennies are worth just under $18 million. So if we were to go forward with a tax ratification election, we would have those coming into play. And you may recall that one of those golden pennies can be enacted at the local level without an election. The other one is subject to a tax ratification election. And then finally, with the copper pennies, the remaining 13, if those were enacted by voters, that would result in about $58.3 million. So again, the total that we would be looking at there is roughly $96 additional million coming in. That gets us to the $778.4 million. And that concludes the budget update. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah,
along with Steve.
let me make a couple comments first, if you don't mind. So if you look at this slide here, so the 18.76 million that we have there is showing as a hold harmless. So that's the amount of revenue that we got from based on Mukasey and Associates with their plan, and that would have us at the 3% floor. What's interesting is that, there's a lot of uncertainty with this bill, especially with the comp ed numbers, because it's going to be based on addresses and not based on actual free and reduced counts. And so Legislative Budget Board actually has us at having a 3.2% gain, and the hold harmless wouldn't apply to us. And so they actually have us at a gain slightly above the hold harmless. So I do see that as more of the floor. And if it is, in fact, we would be above that, then we really wouldn't be in a hold harmless one-time nature of things. So it's just, I just want to make sure you understand that I don't see a lot of risk in that number long-term, because I think our actual revenue amount is very close to that number, and it may even exceed it, with the Legislative Budget Board actually saying that we would exceed it based on current law. So again, I've seen different numbers from them. I've seen different numbers from O'Casey Associates, different numbers from the Equity Center. There's just there's more uncertainty with this bill than ever before, mainly because of the comp ed numbers, okay? And so, anyway, if you look at this, you could also say, well, goodness, why would you do a TRE? I mean, why are you showing us that if we would have the ability to even gain, and this one, that third column, House Bill 3 with no TRE, that doesn't include the one golden penny that we could get without a TRE. The reason why we may want to consider it is because the districts around us that would be getting significantly more funding than us, they may be in a position to do significant amounts to employee pay that we may not be able to do. And so that's why it's important that we keep that option on the table, for our consideration, okay? As Brian mentioned, I mean, that 22 million surplus in that column, of course, you could add to that with that one golden penny that would handle, certainly 22 million handles at least a 4% raise, with some additional left over for some of the priorities. And so there are some possibilities there to be able to avoid a TRE, but we would just have to see what happens in the final legislation and how it goes. So hopefully that helps put some of that into context.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett. Mr. Rice.
Wow, that's a lot of information. So, Mr. Bassett, Mr. Gunn, remind me, we're going to adopt our budget in June.
Yes, sir.
And then when do we adopt the tax rate? In July or August?
We have in the past in September.
In September.
Hopefully we'll be ready to adopt in August. In the future, depending on which bill you look at, those would get accelerated to always doing it in August after the certified rules come out at the end of July.
All right. So I understand that your dilemma is you have to come up with the budget now, even though the legislature is still wrestling with the public school finance, and we don't know the outcome of that. So you've done two scenarios. One scenario is based on current law, which we understand, we know how to do it, but you've left out the CEI, right?
Well, the CEI is actually in the current law amounts, okay? So that's the only, it is in current law, and that would also, the CEI would be included in terms of any kind of hold harmless calculation, comparing 3% above current law. So
yeah.
The CEI is part of those first two columns.
Well, I may have misunderstood you. I know it's in current law, but I thought you said you had left it out of this budget.
It would not be part of the second two columns of the House Bill 3 columns.
Okay, I guess I misunderstood you on that. I didn't understand what you said.
Sorry.
Nevertheless, okay. On, Mr. Gunn, if you could go to slide 3, please. So the 5% property value growth, that's based on your best estimates and talking to Glenn Whitehead and his staff right now.
And some analysis we've done. Go ahead and tell them what kind of analysis we do.
Sorry?
Go ahead and tell them what kind of analysis we do to help back that up.
So there's a couple of points that the meeting with Glenn Whitehead is actually the last component of what we do. That was a triangulation meeting. But prior to that, we're looking at how things have grown historically. We actually did some, I guess you could say, background work where we worked with Colliers, our real estate advisors, and they provided us with what actual year-over-year home sales look like within the Fort Bend ISD pattern. And they were showing growth of about 4% year-over-year on sales. However, that sales data is only related to existing stock. It doesn't include new homes that have come onto the market. Unfortunately, As you're aware, with sales disclosure, that information isn't freely available, so they do not account for that in the analysis that they did. So we're aware that obviously Harvest Green, the Sienna Plantation area continue to grow, and that is adding some of that additional value into our analysis that's accounting for the 5% growth. And again, that last step in there was to triangulate with the county appraisal district, and what they were telling us is that their early estimates were showing 5%. As we've said before, they tend to be very conservative on what they provide to us, so we were comfortable using 5% at the end of that process.
Okay. And the CPTD, that's the Comptroller's Property Tax Division,
Correct.
and so you're estimating that they'll be just below 5%.
Correct, and that is
It's pretty close.
Right, that is a final number that was issued in January, so that is a number that we are certain of. And again, the closer we are to that number, that means basically the revenue that we're projecting, we can expect to, you may recall, if we're higher, we tend to have to pay it back the following year. But with that parity there, we basically would be retaining all revenue received from the state.
All right. But if we have this growth, and then the state is talking about holding us at 2.5%, correct? And municipalities at 3.5%, but school districts at 2.5% growth. Okay, and so the new Austin yield is going to be $126?
That's assuming that it remains in place. So the Austin yield is based on current law. With a change to the House Bill 3, that yield is, they changed the way that that's calculated. But again, the way that we're calculating the budget that we file will be based on that yield.
So all that supports a budget based on current law.
Yes,
And
sir.
that's what the Austin yield currently is, but that is going to change under the new law.
Yeah.
That's going to go down, what did you tell me, Mr. Bassett, to
96.
96,
Would be the value of the golden pennies, decoupling it from the Austin yield. But the 126 is based on LBB, and that's what's in the actual budget that was adopted in the appropriations.
Okay. And on page 4, the unfunded priorities under review, those are the board's or the district's unfunded priorities that we're looking at. How would we get those funded right now? Okay, 28 million. And then, okay, on page, what page is this? Yeah, that page. So, current law, the budget with the TRE, and I think you said that, Mr. Gunn, that's net of recapture, that's 17 pennies, the 35.28.
That is correct. It is net of recapture.
Okay.
At $1.17.
$1.17, okay. All right. And when, if they do pass this new budget, when will that go into effect? For 1920?
It would be in place for the
Immediately.
1920 school year. That's
Okay.
right.
And the 5-year, on page 7, so the projected revenue, yes, that slide, you're saying that's a 5-year revenue projection. In other words, they're telling us this is what it's going to be like for 5 years only?
No, that's so what this is showing is actually the impact if we were to do a tax ratification election in 1920. This is how that revenue stacks up to equal to 778 million. Now included in that 778 million is 18.8 million that only has a 5-year life cycle. So the hold harmless provision, that's that second column on there from the left, that would potentially go away after 5 years.
And we could lose $18 million unless they do something else.
Well, so that's the minimum, and that's why we're including that number, because it's 3% above current law, and that's the number we got from O'Casey and Associates, probably the most reliable set, and they also because they have our data. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
we give them we give them all the data that they need to make those projections. But in terms of if the hold harmless wasn't there, okay, we wouldn't be at zero in terms of revenue for House Bill 3. We'd at least have the early education allotment, which is 8.1 million. But if you look at what the Legislative Budget Board is projecting, they think we'll actually be above, the 18.8. And so there is some risk long term, with what we think, but I think it's minimal given the numbers that we've seen.
Okay, I'll have some other questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Rosenthal.
Thank you. Just one quick question, Steve. When we talked this afternoon, I just wanted to make sure I understood. So, based on the current proposal in House Bill 3, our current tax rate on the M&O side of $1.06 is going to get compressed to $1.02.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, 4-penny decrease.
Okay, so that's where we would have room to kind of, if nothing else, potentially bring that back up and recognizing two of these golden pennies and, okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. Okay, just piggybacking off of what Mr. Rice said, I think I understand the hold harmless 18.76 million. We might not qualify for that. You're estimating that we probably will qualify, and that lasts for 5 years, and then it ends. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, the floor for House Bill 3 of a 3% gain above current law. That's the way the bill is set right now. Is that would be in place. That floor would be in place for 5 years.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question is, one golden penny, how much is that worth?
So
Or
it's
the
roughly
golden pennies?
just under 9 million. Just under 9 million.
Okay, so they're about 9 million apiece,
Yes, those two
and
pennies.
there's two available after the compression for us.
Yes, ma'am.
One we would qualify for. The second one we would need to have a TRE for.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. And then my last comment is kind of related to something Mr. Rice brought up again. The next time you bring this back to us next month, would it be possible for you to please bring us some projections that go out a little bit further, maybe a 3-year or 5-year projection, so we can understand what that would look like into the future, what our budget would look like into the future?
Yes, yeah, we usually would do that, yes.
Yep, that's it. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mrs. Towson.
Okay, really quickly, I want to clarify something, and then I'm going to raise a couple of concerns. So if the LBB is correct and we're at 3.2%, then the 18.76 doesn't go away in 5 years. We keep it.
That's right.
Okay, so I just want to clarify that. So hopefully the LBB is correct and it's not a 5-year hold harmless, but we keep that money. I'm going to do a little math here because I want to see if I'm correct and what HB3 says and what we're going to get. So let's say HB3 passes the Senate as is, which we all know is not going to happen, but let's pretend that it is. We're going to get 18.76 million. That's what we're assuming, right? 25% of that minimum has to go to teacher raises.
25% of the basic allotment has to go to teacher raises.
How much of that is the basic allotment?
Well, it depends. It's really going to depend on how that's interpreted, because 8.1% of that is the early reading allotment for us, and so the increase in the overall amount of the basic allotment, I mean, it would be going from 5140 to 6030.
Right.
Okay, so that was based on the slide we showed last time. What was that percentage? It was like $225 worth.
Right.
Okay, and so we would need to calculate that out. Now, that's where you get into, I'm sorry to say this, but yet another hold harmless, where they say that if you have to give at that if that's the way the mandatory raise shook out, and we would have to allot a basic allotment worth $225, I think that could exceed what we're looking at here.
That's what it's looking like when I do my calculations.
Right, and then we're supposed to be held harmless to that mandatory salary amount.
So they are going to hold us harmless for that, because that's
Actually,
my question.
plus 4.2% for related benefits. So that was actually in the original version of House Bill 3. that hold harmless for the mandatory mandatory salaries did not go away when the bill was amended.
So the reason I'm asking this question is because if we're gonna get 18.76 and 8.4 of that includes mandatory pre-K, right? So that brings us down to roughly 10 million. And then 25% of something is mandated to teacher pay raises. So that just doesn't leave a whole lot left.
Exactly.
So I'm, so my point is that I just want everyone out there listening to understand that it's not 18.76 million. It's not even, in fact, it's probably less than half of that. And I took the 25% of the whole 18.6 and I got us right at 5.5 million is where I got us at what we're gaining ultimately. So it may be a little bit more than that, but it's probably not a whole lot more than that. So if we have to talk about a TRE, the community needs to understand that Fort Bend ISD might be getting $5, $6, maybe $7 million more, and that's it. It's not 18.76 million. Now we're, the mandatory full day pre-K we have supported for the reasons that we talked about earlier, but when you pull 8.4 million out of our increase, that's almost half of what we're getting. And then 25% to teacher pay raises, which we've always supported teacher pay raises up here, and we really want to give that. But we just need to put it into perspective. So that's why I'm asking those questions. And we haven't even talked about SB2. So Mr. Rice alluded to that earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, SB2 has a 2.5% property value cap. So your 5%, if they cap us at 2.5%, then we're looking at half of the value growth that you're estimating.
No, exactly. So the way that they're supposed to make that up, the state is supposed to make up that amount. What's the mechanism, that would be in place? I'm not exactly sure. Okay. Will not apply to the debt service fund. So at least we have part of the equation is not, totally messed up or thrown in the air, but to do it at the 2.5% cap, if you were going to exceed that, you'd have to have an election, or whatever else. But anyway, they say they would be able to make that up over time, through the formulas. So they're going to have to adjust
The state says
that.
they can make it up.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of confidence in that.
No, I would
Especially since
agree.
we don't have a revenue stream yet that's connected to that. I haven't heard it. We've talked they've talked a little bit about increasing the sales tax, but there's a lot of pushback on that as well. So.
Right. The overall budgets were originally built on 7% value growth
Right.
throughout the state. Okay. To
And
cap
those
it
are
at
the budgets that are going into conference committee right now.
Right.
Are based on 7%.
Right. So to cap it at 2.5%, to be able to come up with, 4.5%, to be able to make up for that within the sales taxes, I just don't see it. I don't see how they could do that.
Okay. Well, those are some concerns that I have, and I think it's really important that everyone listening is hopefully paying attention and they understand that even these numbers that we're looking at in this budget right here, we need to make sure we understand where those dollars are going and where they're mandated to go under the laws should they pass as written, because it's going to seriously impact how we build this budget. And I know we have to approve something in June, but it seems to me that depending on what happens, we may have to throw a lot of it out and almost start over. So I think as a board, need to be prepared for that.
No, I agree. And the reason why we're showing things this way is it's important for us to keep our options open depending on what's going to happen, because I do believe that the bill will look totally different once it does pass. Okay. And I do think something, will pass. And so I think it's important to keep the options open to be able to have a TRE this year, and also to keep the options open as to when that TRE would happen. If Senate Bill 2 went into effect, future TREs would only be done in November, okay? And that's difficult, makes things difficult for school districts because of the planning, that we do, and to have that many months of revenue uncertainty when your fiscal year starts July 1st, can be problematic. And so right now we're trying to keep our options open for this August or November, just depending on how we put things together, knowing that in the future it would never work out that way. It would only be for November. So that's why, I hate that we're showing you 4 columns here for 1 year, but that's the situation that we're in.
And in the meantime, we may have to do an efficiency study, or will likely have to do an efficiency study before we could even call a TRE, which means that's something we need to keep at the forefront of our planning now, because even if we would plan for November, that's not a whole lot of time to get somebody in here to do that. So.
Yeah, so as far as the timing for that is concerned, we don't know. And again, whether or not, that'd be in the final bill, but I would expect something along those lines to be in the final bill.
Well, it's in both right now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think it's pretty safe to say something like that's gonna pass, so. Okay, thank you. Thanks for all your work on this.
Thank you, Mrs. Tossan. Mr. Rosenthal?
One quick point, and you brought this up last month, I think. All we've talked about is increase in teacher salaries, okay, which, again, we all agree, okay? But then there's staff. So if we were to give, because, kind of be fair, you want to try to be fair or do something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, you're not even accounting for that in here.
Well, that 10 million is for all staff for 2%.
Okay, it is. Okay,
Yes.
okay, good. All right, good. I'm glad we clarified that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation and all the information. We will now convene in closed session under the Texas Open Meetings Act, Chapter 551, and those sections listed in the agenda, and for the purpose of private consultation with the board's attorney on any or all subject matters authorized by law. We are now convened in closed session.